He didn't look like a killer. That's the part that still haunts people. When they think of evil, they picture shadows, snarling monsters, deranged faces. But Ted Bundy was none of those things. He was attractive, charismatic, intelligent. A law student with a polite smile and neatly combed hair. A man who helped old ladies carry groceries and volunteered on political campaigns. The kind of man who could sit beside you on a bus, hold a door open, ask about your day, and within hours, you'd be gone. That was his power, not just his hands. Not just the tire iron or the crowbar or the ropes he kept hidden. His true weapon was trust. And in the early 1970s, across college towns and quiet neighborhoods, trust was in abundance. The fear came later. Ted Bundy wasn't born in darkness. He was born into confusion. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946. In a Vermont home for unwed mothers, his life began with a lie. He was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. That distortion of identity of who he was would quietly metastasize inside him for years, invisible and insidious. When his mother finally told him the truth, something in Ted fractured. He felt abandoned, lied to, less than, but he didn't show it. That would become his pattern. Pain masked as charm, rejection sealed behind a smile, rage dressed in politeness. As he grew up in Tacoma, Washington, he began to sharpen that mask. He was clean-cut, reserved, but intelligent. Teachers called him bright but aloof. He obsessed over control, hated weakness, and showed signs early on, like placing knives around his aunt's body as she slept. Watching her wake in terror, a blank look on his face. But again, nothing stuck. He was just a little strange. At the University of Washington, he studied psychology. Ironically, he also fell in love for the first time with a woman who had come to define the beginning of his transformation. She was elegant, wealthy, from a good family. She represented everything Ted wanted but couldn't sustain. And when she left him, without warning, he unraveled quietly, mask still on. That rejection became fuel, a rage that needed an outlet. And he would later admit that many of his victims resembled her. Same long dark hair, same part down the middle, same trusting smile. The killings began shortly after. Seattle, 1974. Women began vanishing. Not from dark alleys or dangerous bars, but from libraries, campuses, broad daylight. No signs of struggle, just gone. A witness once described a man in a cast, asking for help loading books into his car. Harmless, polite, the kind of guy you'd feel good about helping. That was the trap. Ted often faked injuries to gain sympathy wearing slings, or pretending to limp, drawing women closer until it was too late. He would strike swiftly, often with a blunt object, rendering his victims unconscious before taking them elsewhere. What he did after is the part people can't forget. He confessed to decapitating some, returning to their bodies days later to violate them. He kept trophies, hair, jewelry, sometimes even body parts. And yet, during all this, he had a steady girlfriend. He attended law school. He smiled for photographs. That duality is what made him terrifying. He wasn't insane in the way people hoped. He was cold, calculating, deliberate. When police finally released a composite sketch and partial description of the man named Ted, dozens of women called in, including his own girlfriend. But he was too normal, too polished. He slipped through. Months passed. The bodies piled up. Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, different states, same signature. Young women, brunette, vanished. Police were overwhelmed. Jurisdictions didn't communicate, and Ted, now emboldened, began to get sloppy. In 1975, he was pulled over in Utah. Inside his car, police found masks, handcuffs, rope, a crowbar, a killer's toolkit. Was arrested for kidnapping but refused to confess to the murders. But they had enough to charge him. He was sent to jail. And then he escaped. In 1977, while awaiting trial in Colorado, Bundy jumped out of a second-story courthouse window, just vanished into the snow. He was free for 6 days before being caught again. This time the jail increased security. But Ted was always thinking, always planning. He dropped weight, cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell, and crawled into the void. On December 30th, 1977, while the guards partied for New Year's, Bundy vanished once more, this time for good. The nation panicked. A serial killer was loose again. He fled to Florida under a fake name. And within weeks, the rage returned. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened there was not calculated, it was a frenzy. A massacre. In under 15 minutes, he bludgeoned and strangled four women too fatally. Then, just a month later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. That would be his final victim. He was arrested in Pensacola, driving a stolen car, tired, disheveled, teeth marks still matching wounds on the girls. This time, he didn't run. He prepared for trial. And in the most chilling twist of all, he represented himself in court. He questioned witnesses, smiled at jurors, and turned the trial into a twisted theater. Cameras rolled as he cross-examined police about crime scenes he created. People were horrified, and yet some were charmed. Women came to court to see him. Some fell in love. One even married him. The power of his mask endured Evan, as the blood pooled beneath it. But justice caught up. In 1989, after years on death row, Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair. His final words? "Give my love to my family. No apology. No remorse." Just a smile that, even in death, refused to crack. There was always something deeper lurking behind Ted Bundy's eyes, something calculating, something hungry, something that smiled because it knew it was being watched. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be remembered. And the scariest part was NT that he murdered at least 30 women. That he made the world fall in love with his image while he did it. Psychologists tried to box him into terms like narcissist, sociopath, psychopath, antisocial disorder, but Ted wasn't interested in labels. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was the predator who studied psychology to understand his prey, the killer who read law books to dismantle. The systems meant to stop him, the monster who knew he was a monster, enjoyed the mask of being anything but. His confidence came not from chaos, but from control. He orchestrated every moment. From the smile he gave to his victims when they helped him carry a fake cast, to the gentle tone he used when asking strangers for directions, everything was a calculated lie, a dance. He never needed a weapon, his words were sharper. And yet, it wasn't just strangers who were fooled. Ted Bundy had girlfriends, he had friends, held jobs, worked hotlines for suicide prevention, even saved lives. As Ted Bundy saved lives, he sat in rooms with people on the brink, talked them down with kindness, warmth, and patience. All while driving across state lines at night, looking for someone to kill. That contradiction is what broke the world's understanding of evil. It shattered the black and white image of a maniac and replaced it with a far more terrifying one. A man who could choose when to be a monster and when not to. People who knew him personally refused to believe it. His longtime girlfriend, Liz, stayed by his side through years of suspicion, refusing to accept what her heart screamed wasn't possible, but it was. And she would later say she saw Hintz's late-night disappearances, the cold moods, the locked drawers, but she couldn't fathom it. None of them could, because Ted looked like us, talked like us, and that's what made him deadly. Even the media fell for it. When his trial became national news, the cameras focused not on his crimes but on his charm. Headlines read "Handsome Killer" and "The All-American Murderer." Audiences didn't just watch in horror, they watched in fascination. Courtroom footage shows him smiling, adjusting his tie, confidently addressing the judge as if he were giving a college debate. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was performing, and people couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, though, the damage was impossible to erase. The families of his victims sat just feet away, forced to watch as the man who destroyed their daughters made jokes, flirted with reporters, and twisted the law into a stage. One mother, when asked what justice would look like, simply whispered, "Silence." I want him to stop speaking. But Ted wouldn't stop. He thrived on attention. Every interview, every book written about him, every reporter who said Ted Bundy was another notch in his legacy. He once said, "I'm the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet." And still, people sent him fan mail. Women wrote love letters. Some came to court dressed like his victims' long dark hair, parted in the middle, almost like an offering. It was as if his evil infected the public's imagination. He had become a myth, a celebrity, a riddle. And no one, not even those tasked with executing him, could escape the sick gravity of his charisma. What made him even more dangerous was how much he enjoyed the game. Ted would intentionally give detectives just enough information to stay relevant. Dangled confessions, hinted at bodies never found, used the truth as leverage. When he realized the clock was ticking toward execution, he began naming victims one by one, not out of remorse, but to delay death. His final interviews were not apologies, but negotiations. He claimed pornography was the root of his violence, a last-minute scapegoat meant to soften the memory of what he really was. But the truth couldn't be erased. It lived in the forest where he dumped bodies, in the eyes of the victims who survived him, in the bones still never found. And in the end, it lived in our own fascination. Because Ted Bundy exposed more than the horror of murder. He exposed us our obsession with killers, our attraction to darkness, our belief that evil must look like a monster. But sometimes evil wears a suit, holds a law degree, smiles at cameras, says yes sir to the judge, and sometimes it holds the door open for you before leading you to your grave. By the time Ted Bundy arrived in Florida, the blood on his hands had already dried in half a dozen states. The trail he left behind was colder than the snow he escaped through. But if anyone thought he would hide, lay low, or even try to be someone else, they were wrong. Because in his final chapter, Bundy didn't just kill, he escalated, snapped. He let the monster out, fully unmasked, not even pretending to be the charming drifter anymore. On January 15th, 1978, barely 2 weeks after his second escape from jail, Ted Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened in those early morning hours wasn't just a murder, Sprite was a slaughter. Bundy moved through the sorority like a phantom, silent and brutal. In just under 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy died from bludgeoning and strangulation. Their skulls fractured, their bodies mutilated. 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were left permanently injured. Mere blocks away, he broke into another apartment and attacked Cheryl Thomas, breaking her jaw, damaging her hearing, leaving her with lifelong scars. No one saw him coming. No one heard him leave. For a moment, it looked like he'd vanish again, another shadow lost in a city full of strangers. But he had already become sloppy. He left hair, bite marks, a timeline. And soon, the panic spread. The public didn't know it was Bundy, not yet. But the brutality screamed serial killer, and it was clear this wasn't his first time. As detectives scrambled to make sense of the chaos, Bundy was already driving west. Still using stolen cars, fake IDs, and hollow names, he moved like a ghost toward the Florida Panhandle. But this time, something changed. He made a mistake. On February 9th, he abducted a 12-year-old girl Kimberly Leach, from her junior high school. Witnesses saw him leading her to a van. The pure evil of that act, targeting a child, would later be described as his final descent into depravity. Her body was found weeks later in a pig shed, discarded like trash. Bundy's darkness had consumed everything. At this time, it caught up to him. Just days later, he was pulled over by a Pensacola police officer for driving a stolen car. He fought, he ran, but he was caught. And the moment his name hit the system, law enforcement knew who they had. Ted Bundy was back in custody, but now he was a national nightmare. The trial that followed wasn't just a courtroom proceeding, it was a spectacle. The first trial ever televised nationally in the United States. The cameras rolled. The country watched. And Bundy, ever the showman, saw it as his final performance. He fired his legal team, represented himself, argued motions, cross-examined witnesses. He smiled for the press. Women swooned in the gallery. Some claimed he was innocent. Some believed he was misunderstood. One, Carol Ann Boone, became so enchanted with him that she testified for his defense. Lita married him in court during the trial itself, exploiting an obscure Florida law that allowed a verbal proclamation in front of a judge to count as a legal marriage. Ted Bundy, serial killer, was now married on live television. And yet none of it could erase the evidence. The bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched his teeth perfectly. The fibers, the witnesses, the timelines, everything pointed to him. And slowly the world began to see past the smile, see the coldness in his stare. hear the manipulation in his voice. Even his wife Carol would eventually see through the illusion and divorce him before his execution. Bundy was convicted for the Chi Omega murders in July 1979 and sentenced to death by electric chair. But the show wasn't over. He dragged out appeals for nearly a decade. During that time, journalists, psychologists, FBI agents, and authors interviewed him. He toyed with them all, giving pieces of truth, holding others back. He became a case study for the newly formed FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. He described murder as an addiction, said killing began as a fantasy, then became a compulsion, then a necessity. Murder is not just a crime of violence, he said. It's a crime of control, and that, he revealed himself fully not as a man who lost control, but as a man obsessed with it. Ted Bundy wasn't rage, he was ritual, cold, detached, and driven by domination. But by 1989, the clock had run out. On January 24th at 7:06 a.m., Ted Bundy was strapped to the electric chair inside Florida State Prison. Outside, a crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathered cheering, holding signs, some even selling t-shirts that read "Burn, Bundy, burn." As the electricity coursed through his body, ending the life of one of America's most prolific serial killers, the air outside cracked with applause. But for the families of the victims, closure never truly came. Their daughters, sisters, mothers were still gone, and no amount of voltage could return what Ted had taken. In death, as in life, he remained an enigma, intelligent, handsome, polite predator who could charm a courtroom in the morning and slaughter a girl by nightfall. He didn't look like evil, and that's why he was the perfect disguise for it. The electric chair ended his pulse, but it didn't end the story. If anything, Ted Bundy became more alive in death than he ever was in life, etched into documentaries, podcasts, true crime thrillers, internet theories, and late-night whispers. His name lingers like smoke, curling into every conversation about evil, every case profile, every forensic class. His legacy isn't just carved into the annals of crime, it's carved into culture. Because Ted Bundy didn't just murder Bodies. He murdered certainty, forced an entire generation to question everything they thought they knew about monsters. He shattered the myth that evil wears horns, that killers snarl and stalk and growl. Instead, he smiled. He held babies, passed lie detector tests, he wrote poetry. And yet, inside him lived a coldness so absolute it defied comprehension. Even as his execution drew closer, Bundy remained a people. There was the version the public wanted, the repentant killer, the twisted genius ready to unburden himself. And there was the real Ted, always in control, even of the truth. In his final interviews, he dropped confessions like breadcrumbs, hinted at crimes the courts never caught, suggested the number of his victims was far higher, perhaps over 100, but never gave enough to bring peace. He described himself not as insane, but as consumed by an entity, a dark side that grew with each kill, each fantasy fulfilled. But those who listened closely could hear it. The thrill in his voice, the pride, because Ted Bundy never wanted forgiveness. He wanted attention. He wanted immortality. In a way, he got it. But what he left behind is darker than any body. He left a blueprint for manipulation, for camouflage, for charm as a weapon. And long after his death, others followed it. Killers who studied his methods, stalkers who wore his smile, obsessives who built shrines to him. The scariest part, the culture helped. The world, unable to look away, amplified him. He became a genre, an icon, a twisted celebrity. People sold paintings of his face, women claimed to feel connected to him. And perhaps that's the final crime, the seduction of the story. Because while Bundy reveled in the spotlight, the names of his victims faded. Lisa, Margaret, Kimberly, Denise, Janice, Brenda, names whispered once, and then lost beneath the weight of his legend. They were smart, young, vibrant, full of life, and now reduced to footnotes in his shadow. But they deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for who they were. Daughters, friends, sisters, futures. And yet, for every story we tell about them, we circle back to him, because Bundy isn't just a case. He's a warning, a mirror, a question that haunts everyone who watches his tapes, reads his letters, or studies his profile. Would I have trusted him? Would I have helped him? Would I have seen it coming? And the truth, the terrifying, undeniable truths that most of us wouldn't, because he was everything we're taught to trust. Well-dressed, articulate, educated. Evil didn't just hide behind his smile, it wore it proudly. His charm was the disguise. His intelligence was the weapon, and his victims, they were simply kind. That's what breaks people. Not the brutality, but the betrayal. The idea that you could hold the door for someone like him, or let him walk you to your car, or study beside him in class, within hours be gone, erased. That's what Ted Bundy stole, most a sense of safety. A belief that we can know who to fear. He proved we can't. Because sometimes the killer drives a Volkswagen. Sometimes he brings you coffee. Sometimes he's the last person you'd suspect because he made sure of it. In the years since his execution, investigators have reopened old cases, searching for Bundy's fingerprints and forgotten murders. Some remain unsolved. Some are whispered to match his method, his cruelty, his signature. But Ted took many secrets with him into the flames. And that, too, was his final control. The truth will always be incomplete, always slightly out of reach. And maybe that's what haunts us most, not the monster himself, but the silence he left behind. The chilling, empty space where justice never arrived. But in that space, there's also a lesson, a reckoning, a reminder that real evil doesn't announce itself. It studies, it waits, it learns your weaknesses, it borrows your trust. And then it steps into the light looking exactly like the person you'd least expect. Bundy taught us that, and we can't unlearn it. It became a face we fear. A name we invoke when discussing predators, psychopaths, monsters in disguise. But behind that legacy, beneath the books and movies and documentaries, there remains one final truth that should never be forgotten. Ted Bundy was not a genius, not a mastermind, not a romanticized villain. He was a coward. A man who preyed on the kind, the gentle, the trusting. A man who never fought equals only the vulnerable. A man who used intelligence, not for greatness, but for slaughter. And when you strip away the myth, the charisma, the headlines, what remains is nothing but rot. So let this be the final word. Ted Bundy didn't win. Not in death. Not in memory. Because we remember the names of the victims now. We say them aloud. We light candles in their name. And every time we speak of Bundy, we remember who he took. Not just to mourn, but to warn. Because monsters like him don't hide in darkness. They walk in daylight. Smile in courtrooms. And sometimes, they knock on your door.